What are the qualities of a good CV? Who is a CV for, and how are CVs used? How do you decide on headings? What information is important, and what design aspects need to be considered? So these are the main themes that I'm going to be talking about today. As I just mentioned, if you've got anything else you want me to cover, just pop it into the chat function, and I'll be able to do it on the fly. So one of the things I think it's really good to talk about what a CV is for. And it's your CV, and your CV is going to be very unique because it's going to be a complete record of your academic history that details your experience, credentials, expertise, and accomplishments. It will help you keep track of everything you've done since you started your university education, but it's also used by professors, committees, employers, different review panels, et cetera, to understand both your research and your educational profile, highlighting your expertise and anything that you might have specialized in. When I start to review student CVs, it doesn't matter if they're undergraduate, graduate, or PhD or postgraduate. The most common thing I always hear is, my CV isn't very long, or my CV is not very good. And a good CV isn't long, and a long CV isn't good. And it's really important to keep this in mind, that you can't compare your CV to anybody else's, because everybody has a very unique path to their education and their expertise. What I also found too is that we don't really teach new scholars what we really expect in a CV. It's one of those mysterious academic things that you're just supposed to know. So that's why I'm going to focus on some of the very basics and the essentials of a CV. I just want to reaffirm that page length does not matter. A long CV is not as impressive as a short CV that has higher quality content and is really well organized. So don't be concerned with page length. And at the beginning of your academic journey, your CV will be shorter and it grows over time. You'll find that your categories of importance will shift, your experience will shift, and it will grow. It might shrink, it might expand, but it will change over time. So it's always good to refresh and revise it before each new opportunity. And CVs for undergraduate, graduate students, and postdoctoral fellows, they should all look different, because you're going to have different headers and subheaders because you're at different stages of your academic career. And so with that in mind, if you know how to organize it, it means that it's going to be really easy for the review committee or the individual reviewers to see who you are and what you do and where you are at your stage in your career. Oops. All right. So how we review CVs is interesting, I think. And a lot of, I think, in academia, we think that our CV is going to get critiqued and edited the same way a manuscript or a thesis chapter would be edited. But it's not what we're doing with a CV. We're really doing an inventory of qualifications to see if you're eligible for certain employment positions, scholarships and awards, and for writing reference letters. So when you are preparing your CV, make sure that you're looking at the opportunity you're applying for, and to ensure that elements of your CV will accurately reflect that. So if I'm looking for a lab technician that can make thin sections and use a microscope, then make sure that that is a skill that is highlighted and really visible on your CV. When we're evaluating candidates for scholarships and awards, you also want to make sure that your CV reflects the reward criteria. So just as your technical skills should be present on your CV, your service should also be present on your CV. For example, if you're a member of the executive of GSU, a volunteer at Stella's Circle or Planned Parenthood, or other things that you do within the MUN community, all of these things also go on your CV as well. But I think this is the most frequent time in my career that I've used CVs, and it's for writing reference letters for students. So with my graduate students that I've been supervising for years and years and years, I know their academic profile and I have a letter written out for them. But if it's a new student or a student that I hadn't worked with for a long time, or perhaps it was a student that I knew through an administrative role as opposed to supervisory. I don't know very much about that person that I can put into a really personalized letter. So what you want to be able to do with your CV is have it organized so that if somebody's writing a reference letter for you, we can see these categories of information and we can find quantifiable data. And this is where a CV, it kind of clicks with academics and CVs because, they're data. So I want to be able to tally how much funding you have. I want to see how many degrees you have and when you completed them. I want to know how many years you've been a teaching assistant, how many conferences you've gone to. So when we're crafting a letter, we talk about these experiences in real terms. So when I'm doing a quick review of a CV, so let's say I'm on a committee to give out graduate awards at the university or outside of the university, these are the things that I look for because it helps me organize information. Name and education should be front and clear. Your experience. I should easily be able to identify how many years you were in an academic program, your start and your end date. I should easily be able to tally your experience, the number of scholarships, the number of grants, the number of awards. Also, I keep saying the number of scholarships and awards. Full disclosure, by the time I was applying to my PhD program, I had close to 0 of those. So if you don't have anything yet, don't worry about it. All of these things take a lot of time to build. Another thing too you should have is a clear list of publications and conference presentations, if applicable. When I'm doing reviews of CVs, one of the things that gets in the way of being able to quantify the information about your academic career and experience is organization or lack thereof, and repetition, and just extra stuff that you don't need. So when you're presenting your CV, the information only needs to be stated once. So if you won an award, don't put it under prizes and then have a separate category for awards. Make sure it only happens once, one line on your CV per event. If it's disorganized, that's also really hard to understand. So for example, if you don't separate your paid research experience from your volunteer experience, from community service positions, for example, that's really hard to be able to separate those if we don't know you personally. And so you want to have a clear distinction between your paid expertise and any service or community or volunteer work that you do within the university. A lot of junior scholars too will add other people's names to their CVs. So I actually don't think that this is really necessary. If you had a really, actually this is a bad example and I need to update this slide, but the most important person on a CV is you. Some people will indicate who their supervisors are for their PhD and their MA thesis, but you don't need to identify your supervisory committee or your comprehensive exam committee. If you were a research assistant, sometimes it can actually be more helpful to use the name of the lab or the project as opposed to the name of the person. If somebody was saying research assistant Megan Burchell, it doesn't have as much meaning as research assistant applied archaeological sciences lab. So you want to make sure that you're not overloading your CV with pieces of information that aren't relevant to the evaluation of your qualifications, unless it's highly relevant and very specific. So if you happen to be working with somebody who won a Nobel Prize, you might want to include that at all, but it's not necessary because the most important on your person on your CV is you. Another thing too is non-relevant experience, and this will probably change over time. I see this very common on junior CVs, jobs like babysitting, cashier, high school clubs and involvement. Get rid of all of that. There are some exceptions, so sometimes high school awards or community awards, but I worked at McDonald's unsuccessfully for many years, And I don't put that on my CV. So my CV starts when I started my master's program in 2001. All right, so these are some other common mistakes and sort of little boo-boos that I find that get in the way of a CV. Don't put curriculum vitae or CV on the title. We know what it is. It's funny, there's actually some trends that will change over time. So sometimes if you're looking at a CV from a few years ago, it will say curriculum vitae. Now I think and then the person's name, now a more common trend is just to put your name on there. I think the idea is to save space, and the committee knows that it's a curriculum vitae because it looks like a curriculum vitae. I've already talked about adding extra names and referees. Be careful with that. The other thing too, if you do want to add names, don't use first names, just use the initial or just use doctor. Information should be presented in descending chronological order, most recent first. And then you also want to balance the too little versus too much information. So the University Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador is pretty long to write continuously throughout a CV if you've done 2 or 3 degrees there, or you've been there for a really long time. So use the full title once and then it becomes Memorial University. You can do that with addresses, first names, etc. Just be careful about that. But you also want to make sure you're not leaving out any information. So if you just have something that says Memorial University Scholarship, you need to be more specific. There's lots of scholarships. Entrance scholarship, you want to specify that. The key is I should be able to independently verify and find this information. Another common mistake is not reviewing or modifying your CV before each new opportunity, using institute-specific codes and jargon. So for example, course codes. I sometimes will suggest to students to include relevant courses. So for example, if they wanted to pursue a master's degree program that had some very extensive field work, I would suggest that they have relevant courses listed in their CV if they've taken archaeological field schools or sciences field schools, but I would advise against putting the course code. ANTH 2365 is a course code at a university that's not Memorial University. So it doesn't mean anything to me if I'm reviewing for a Memorial committee if I don't really understand that. So over time you learn what to add and what not to add. Another thing too, I see a lot of early career researchers will put works in progress. A piece of advice that I got a long time ago was that if you can't find it, it doesn't exist. And so unless you have a manuscript that is ready to be submitted, unless your paper has been accepted, you don't really have a works in progress. By now, my works of progress would be longer than my CV. Another thing too, just be tidy, don't dangle between lines, much like how you properly format a bibliography. Make sure all the information is encapsulated properly. Accuracy is a huge component of a CV. Everything you list on your CV must be accurate and verifiable. Resist embellishing any details and make sure that you have the correct terminology. There's a difference between research assistant and research associate. And I think I see some people using research associate because it might sound fancier, but that's actually a different position than a research associate. And so if you're not using the right terms, it kind of makes it look like you might not really know what you're doing. So make sure you use the right terms. Also, there's a distinction between paid work and volunteer work. So if you volunteer for a club or society as part of graduate student development or with an organization off campus, that's volunteer work. And your paid work is your paid on-campus employment. Another note is in funding, there's a difference between scholarships and bursaries, and this has to do with award criteria and how they're adjudicated. So make sure you know the difference. And if you have different currencies, either convert them all to Canadian dollars if you're applying for positions in Canada, or use the annotation. For publications and works in progress, there's different stages. So if you've submitted a manuscript to a journal, then you can actually put submitted as a new header and accepted in press or published. So your CV is always changing as new opportunities arise. A question I get really frequently is, can I put this on my CV if I didn't accept the award? Absolutely, you can totally keep this. So sometimes if you would get two entrance scholarships, so if you got an entrance scholarship to attend Memorial University and an entrance scholarship to attend Trent University, you won two awards, but you declined one and you kept the other one. So you're listing everything that you won on your CV, so you can include that and then just put the word declined, because that's part of your awards and part of your expertise. Another thing I get too is like, can I put this on my CV? It depends how far of a stretch it is from your academic CV or the position that you're applying for. This has a lot to do with junior or early career scholars. Some high school experience can be helpful on a CV, especially if it's related to your experience. But generally, these do leave your CVs after a few years. Um, Babysitting courses, small certification courses, I see this really frequently. Um, Unless you're applying to work through an early career education center or where it would be relevant, you might not want to include that kind of information. And it's difficult because there's a lot of experiences that people will have junior in their career that are important to their development, but might not help in the evaluation of the CV. So just remember they change over time. Part-time, temporary, casual jobs. So I think that this is actually something that should change, because the reality of what graduate students do is a lot more work than what we see. So do we put part-time jobs off campus on our academic CVs? Unfortunately, no, because it's not you're not being evaluated academically, even though the reality is that maintaining your financial state through part-time employment is a skill that shows that you can multitask and you're hardworking and all of these things, but it doesn't go on our CV. Um, so I'm not sure if times will change, but generally no. There again too can always be some exceptions. In undergrad, I was a camp counselor at an archaeology camp. And that actually I put on my CV for education opportunities, TA opportunities, because it showed that I had a little bit of experience teaching and talking about archaeology. Um, I'm talking kind of quickly. I've done this workshop a few times before, so if anybody has any questions or comments or wants me to go back and review anything, just let me know. I think I'm also talking a little bit quickly because the sun has also started to come out, and I would love to be able to get outside this afternoon. So this is a new slide that I introduced in the last session when I talked about this, because I wanted to address some bias that can be entered and how faculty and employers and committees should be reviewing and understanding bias. So it's becoming more common for faculty to take unconscious bias and conscious bias training to create awareness, but unfortunately, people are judged on their gender, age, ethnicity, disability, political views, religious views, marital status, sexual orientation, children dependence, financial status, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's really quite problematic in academia. There's lots of studies done where, for example, there'll be a female candidate and a male candidate, or a female TA and a male TA, and it's always at a disadvantage to the female candidate. So yes, there's bias. How do we confront bias? Well, one of the things that I would suggest is your CV is strictly academic. So I limit and recommend limiting the amount of personal information that you put on your CV. If I didn't have my name on my CV at the very top, I appear as M. Birchall everywhere else throughout my CV, and I actually, it's so robotic, you don't even realize that I'm a human being. I'm more of an archaeology academic robot. So, and I think that would be my advice going forward, is just being aware of bias. One of the things that also happens too is that there are differences cross-culturally, internationally, and even within disciplines in how CVs are reviewed. So when you never have to disclose your picture, citizenship, nationality, or any personal information on your CV. In Canada, North America in general, CVs are not personal at all. In some countries, though, I was actually really quite shocked when I was working in Germany, because it's expected that you include a professional employment photo and your birth date. And I was absolutely shocked, because those are things that in Canada we recognize contribute to a lot of bias. So before you're applying for a new international position or cross-culturally, do a quick Google search about any specific CV expectations before submitting. And if you're unsure, less personal information is more. CVs really should be, the focus is on the work. So here's where it's probably going to be really handy to open up your CV or a blank Word document, or just catch this presentation we're on. These are the general headings that I find are really common on CVs. Academic appointments. This is for after graduate school, if you have a faculty position or a position teaching. Education, for graduate students, this usually appears first. Research expertise. Here, I find this really helpful for junior scholars, because you can actually do a bullet or point form list of some of your skills and expertise. Publications, conferences, invited lectures, or talks, presentations, research funding, scholarships and awards, academic and professional affiliations, university service, and volunteer experience. This is not an exhausted list. You'll find that the priorities will change for new opportunities and over time, and your headings and subheadings will always continuously change. So as I mentioned previously, there is a little bit of a difference in some disciplines and what's helpful to see on a CV and what's expected. So for example, in archaeology, one category could sometimes be fieldwork experience or laboratory experience. So if you've done a training course in a lab, or if you've completed on like something like that, that actually is something that allows me to evaluate the skills and training of archaeologists that want to come and work with me. Other things can include experimental design, clinical studies. Another one is student supervision. So for example, if you have a peer mentoring framework in your lab group, supervising new and incoming students as part of an RA position, public engagement, and you can also add your own. It's always a really good idea to talk to your supervisor or other people in the field, just to see what information do you include on your CV. So I'd like to talk just briefly about some design basics to help readability of CVs. I find being able to guide the reader to specific sections using capital letters or bold font, I find that a really effective technique. So I use that for headings, bold for subheadings, italics, much like a bibliography, titles of books, conferences, journals. A note about using a serif or a sans serif font. Uh, some are more readable than others, but I believe in terms of accessibility, I think a sans serif font like Arial is actually more accessible, but I know some people also find Times New Roman easier to read. But Times New Roman or Arial are really two common fonts. I use Garamond, which looks a lot like Arial, but there's actually lots of online discussions about what font you should use for your CV. I do like alternating the size. 14-point font is great for your name, because that's really what you want people to remember. And then 12-point font for everything else, your CV details. Don't go much smaller than 12 point. because you want to make sure it's legible if it's on screen or if it's printed, until you get to a point where you've got so much stuff on your CV that putting it into a smaller font is almost critical. So I have some very, very, very minute details on my CV that are in very, 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 very tiny font, because I know that it's not that important, but it needs to be there. All right, so I just wanted to show the difference between effects for spacing, just to look at readability. So I highly recommend that you get in touch with your own design style. Mine is pretty cold and robotic. Um, oh, pardon me, sorry, I'm talking about serif and sans serif fonts. So that's Garamond, that's Arial. You can see the difference. It might be helpful if you're using Arial to space out between to make it easier to read. Ah, here's an example of spacing. So one trend with a lot of CVs is to cram everything line by line by line. I think it's actually easier to read. I like to separate my heading. I use tabs to separate the text. I bold the dates, and all the information is there that needs to be there. So if somebody was evaluating my education from just by looking at this, you could see that I have 3 degrees, and it took 12 years to finish 3 degrees. Did I do that right? Oh, I can't remember. Sorry. All right. So cancel for COVID. This is a new and more recent question that has come up obviously this year because of COVID. And I think it's a really good idea to include how COVID potentially interrupt certain experiments or things that were happening. So for example, I had a postdoc that was supposed to be coming to work with me for a few months. We applied for funding, we got the grant, we made travel arrangements, we canceled all the travel arrangements. So what I've done is I've put it in gray font on my CV, so it's there, but it's not super important to read. But I think for early career researchers and junior scholars, something like the Aldrich Conference, which really unfortunately had to be canceled because of COVID, um, that's really good to put it on there because it means that your abstract was accepted. Your research was accepted to be presented at a conference. So definitely include that on there as part of your CV. Another thing too, I think that's come up with COVID is that I hear a lot of chit chat about how people are worried that my CV is not going to have anything for a year. Well, nobody's CV is really going to have anything for a year. We've had to shift how we work. And one of the things that we're doing is we're doing more webinars. We're looking at online training. We're joining writing clubs and research groups. All of these kinds of activities count, and they can actually show how you have adapted to technology, adapted to remote learning. So one section that I never thought that I would have on my CV is webinar development. But after a few weeks of lockdown, Julie and I started chatting about what we could do about webinars. Like I could develop some webinars, and I've I've done this. So I absolutely include this on my CV because it's part of the work that I do within the academic community. And so I've had to build a new category. So if you attend webinars, webinars attended, it shows the kinds of skills and training that you've taken advantage of. So I'm wrapping up now, but I'll just leave you with a few hints. Don't be afraid to try out different styles to find one that suits you. I have a friend who has colors on their CV and it looks lovely. It's not for me, but it looks great and it works for them. So don't be afraid to try your own personal style. Many profs will have their CVs online. You can use them and review them and use their format, or better yet, learn from their mistakes and improve on them. If you're not sure, let somebody you trust review it before you submit it. Ideally, you should be able to ask your thesis supervisor. You can also use the Writing Center for any help with reviewing, and that's a great way just to have edits and clarity all discussed for you. And just remember that a good CV is a clear CV. So I think that's all I have for the formal presentation part. Does anybody have any questions? If you do, you can use your mic or you can participate in the chat. I'm happy to answer specific or general questions or troubleshoot CV subjects or anything like that. So let me know if you have any comments or thoughts.
Thanks, Megan. I'll stop the recording now.
Okay, thank you.